Hello there, and welcome to Dream Myths. During the reign of King Arthur, when knights rode with honor and the air of Cornwall carried the salt of the sea, there lived a farmer's son named Jack. He was no ordinary youth. Quick of wit, sharp of tongue, and clever beyond his years, Jack possessed a mind so keen that none could outmatch it. Yet in those days, terror had taken root in Cornwall. From the rocky heights of St. Michael's Mount, there emerged a giant called Coraran, 18 feet tall, with shoulders like slabs of stone and eyes that burned with cruelty. He strode across the land as though it were his own. Villagers fled at the sound of his steps, for he thought nothing of seizing cattle by the herd or roasting men as though they were morsels of meat. Hopelessness spread through Cornwall like a plague. No knight dared face him. No council could agree upon a plan. But Jack, still young and untested, stepped forward with a calmness that silenced the crowd. He offered to rid the land of this monster. With cunning hands, he dug a pit 22 feet deep, camouflaged it with branches and soil, and then lured Coraran from his cavern. The earth shook as the giant thundered forth, only to crash headlong into the trap. Swift as thought, Jack struck the fatal blow. Thus was born the name that would echo across Britain, Jack the Giant Killer. His triumph was more than a victory. It was a proclamation that wit and daring could triumph over brute force. Word of his deed traveled far, beyond the hills of Cornwall and across distant borders. In the markets and taverns, whispers rose that this young man's destiny might reach farther than any mortal's before him. Some even claimed the tale reached ears not human at all. Beings of shadow and flame, hidden in the deep places of the world, stirred uneasily at the sound of his name. And in the crowded marketplace of Cornwall, where prophets sometimes muttered riddles of doom, a chilling phrase began to circulate: if Jack does not stop, the world will never be the same again. News of Jack's triumph spread far and wide until it reached the ears of Blunderbore, a giant of dreadful reputation who ruled over a castle deep within the forest. Unlike Coraran, whose strength lay in sheer brutality, Blunderbore was cunning and vengeful. Upon hearing that a mere youth had slain his kinsman, he swore an oath of vengeance so terrible that even his own servants trembled at the sound. Not long after, Jack, weary from travel, rested beside a woodland spring. There, sleep overcame him, and fate took its chance. Blunderbore, passing by, saw the golden letters embroidered upon Jack's belt and knew this was the very giant slayer he had vowed to destroy. Without mercy, he lifted Jack upon his shoulder and carried him to the castle. The fortress was grim, its courtyard strewn with bones of the fallen. fallen. As Jack was locked away in a high chamber, he heard a strange sound echoing through the stone walls. It was the faint, haunting melody of strings, played not by mortal hands, but, as the villagers whispered, by the restless spirits of those who had perished there. The music seemed to weave sorrow into the very air, a warning from the dead themselves. Yet, Jack was never one to surrender. From his prison window, he saw Blunderbore return with his brother, eager to share the feast of their captive. With swift thought, Jack fashioned 2 nooses from the cords he found in the chamber and lowered them from the window. When the giants passed below, the loops tightened around their throats. The castle shook as their massive bodies fell, and Jack, sliding down the ropes, ended their lives with his blade. The dungeons were opened, and noble ladies long imprisoned were freed from torment, their gratitude shining brighter than any treasure. Still, Jack's journey pressed on, and in Wales he found himself at the door of another giant, this one bearing 2 heads. The monster welcomed him with honeyed words and gestures of false kindness, yet the air carried unease. As Jack lay awake in his chamber, he heard whispers from beyond the wall. One voice was soft and coaxing, the other harsh and cruel. The 2 heads quarreled in low tones, one speaking of hospitality, the other plotting murder before dawn. Sensing danger, Jack placed a stout log beneath the covers of his bed and withdrew into the shadows. At midnight, the door creaked open. The giant crept in with a club heavy enough to shatter stone. With a roar, he struck the bed again and again, convinced he had dashed his guest to pieces. But the chamber filled only with silence, save for the echo of a distant, unseen bell tolling faintly in the night, as though fate itself kept count of Jack's narrow escapes. When morning came, Jack descended the stairs, whole and unscathed. The giant, bewildered, forced him to prove his strength at breakfast, presenting a cauldron-sized bowl of porridge. But Jack, ever resourceful, concealed most of it in a leather bag beneath his cloak. With a sly grin, he slid open the bag, spilling the porridge onto the floor as though from his own belly. The 2-headed monster, unwilling to be outdone, seized a knife and tore open his own flesh, collapsing in a pool of his folly. Thus, Jack prevailed once more, each escape more miraculous than the last, while that spectral tolling lingered in the air, a reminder that destiny was not yet finished with him. In those days, when gallant knights sought peril as a path to glory, Prince Arthur, the only son of the great king, set his heart upon on a noble quest. Word had spread of a lady of rare beauty who was enslaved by 7 evil spirits, and though many had despaired of her deliverance, the prince vowed to break her bondage. His father at first forbade the journey, yet love and valor burned so fiercely within him that the king relented, granting him horses and a sum of gold to aid his cause. As he passed through the towns of Wales, the prince encountered a bitter law. The body of a generous man was denied burial for debts unpaid. Compassion stirred within him, and without hesitation, he gave away his wealth to satisfy the creditors, coin after coin, until his purse was empty. The crowd cheered his virtue, praising his nobility. Yet among the whispers came another voice. A man too kind is ripe for ruin, for even demons feast upon the soft of heart. By nightfall, the prince had nothing left but his honor. It was then that Jack crossed his path, hearing of the sacrifice and marveling at the generosity. With no hesitation, Jack offered his service, declaring that wit and courage might yet fill the purse that gold had emptied. The prince, moved by such loyalty, welcomed him as a companion on the perilous road. Not long after, Jack's cunning was put to trial. In the depths of a forest loomed the fortress of a giant with 3 heads, each more dreadful than the last. The earth quaked with his steps, and he boasted he could scatter 500 armored men as though they were straw. Approaching boldly, Jack hailed him as a kinsman, weaving a tale that King Arthur's son approached with an army to slay him. Terrified, the giant begged for safety, and Jack, masking mischief with courtesy, led him to a vaulted dungeon. The iron doors groaned shut, and the bars were drawn. Alone in the darkness, the 3-headed brute muttered curses that coiled like serpents through the stone. The curse is begun. The slayer shall know the cost of his triumph. Yet Jack paid no heed, for he had already turned to the chamber where the giant's treasures lay. There, he found 4 relics of otherworldly power, a coat that veiled its wearer from mortal sight, a cap that whispered the secrets of all things, a sword whose edge could not be stayed, and slippers that carried one swifter than the wind. As Jack's hands touched them, each relic trembled faintly, as if awakening from slumber, as though they had waited centuries for him and him alone. Armed now with the cunning of the mind and the strength of enchantment, Jack rejoined the prince. Destiny, like a storm gathering on the horizon, was only beginning to break. The journey led them at last to a fortress shrouded in dread, where the prince's beloved was held in thrall. Though her beauty was unearthly, her eyes betrayed a torment not her own, for 7 demons had fastened themselves upon her soul. She received the prince with a smile of cold grace, weaving enchantment into her words as she laid before him a trial. A silken handkerchief pressed to his lips was secreted away, and she decreed that unless he produced it by morning, his life would be forfeit. The prince, despairing, confided his plight to Jack, but Jack, who now bore the cap of knowledge, discerned the hidden path, cloaked in darkness and borne by enchanted slippers swifter than the gale. He followed the maiden into the abyss of night. Before the throne of Lucifer she knelt, entrusting the handkerchief to the archfiend himself. Yet Jack, unseen, stretched forth his hand and in one motion reclaimed it. At dawn, when the lady demanded proof, the prince delivered the token, and her composure faltered for the first time. But her cunning was not yet spent. That evening, she kissed the prince upon the lips, binding him to a second trial, to reveal by morning whose lips had last touched hers, or surrender his head. Once more, Jack donned the garments of sorcery. Through shadowed corridors he pursued her as she called upon her familiar spirit. Before Lucifer she stood again, reproaching him for her earlier defeat. To seal her triumph, she pressed her mouth to his loathsome visage, declaring that no mortal could ever claim such a kiss. It was then that Jack drew the rusty sword, relic though it was, and with one swift stroke severed the demon's head. Yet, as it fell, Lucifer's mouth curled into a ghastly smile, as though mocking the very notion of finality. The severed head was concealed beneath Jack's cloak, carried back to the prince as the night swallowed its echoes. At dawn, the princess, eyes gleaming with cruel anticipation, demanded her proof. With steady hands, the prince unveiled the demon's head. At once, the 7 spirits that possessed her shrieked in unison, a sound so violent that it shattered the morning sky like thunderclaps tearing the heavens apart. Then came silence so absolute that only the quickened beating of Jack's heart could be heard, a pause between terror and deliverance. When the silence broke, the maiden stood transformed, her beauty no longer marred by shadow but radiant with unclouded grace. The curse was ended, the demons scattered. She and the prince were joined in marriage, and their union was celebrated with joy. Yet somewhere deep within the silence of that moment lingered a question. For the memory of Lucifer's final smile remained, a whisper that perhaps evil does not die but merely waits. Jack's renown did not end with the fall of Lucifer, nor with the deliverance of the enchanted lady, for the land was still haunted by giants, each one crueler than the last, and Jack's path was far from finished. Not long after, he came upon a cavern where a monstrous brute had made his dwelling. The giant's breath was like the bellows of a forge, his eyes burning with malice. Within the cave, prisoners languished, men and women taken only to be fattened for his feasts. With steady resolve, Jack advanced, and with one stroke of his enchanted blade, drove the life from the creature. The ground trembled beneath its fall, sending ripples across the hillside. Freed captives poured from the prison, their gratitude mingling with awe, for to them it seemed the earth itself bore scars each time a giant was slain. Villagers whispered that the fissures splitting the fields were not merely of stone, but wounds carved into the very soul of England. Yet the shadow of vengeance followed close. Word spread of Thunderdell, a giant with 2 heads and a hunger for retribution. He stormed the countryside, roaring his challenge, his footsteps like thunder over the moors. Jack, ever resourceful, devised his trap across the moat of a fortress he had fortified. He left a single plank unbroken upon the drawbridge. When Thunderdell, maddened by rage, pursued him at full charge, the plank shattered beneath his colossal weight. The 2-headed beast plunged into the waters, thrashing in blind fury until Jack's blade ended him. The people rejoiced, but their joy was laced with reverence. Shrines began to appear in the villages, stones stacked, candles lit, offerings laid in Jack's honor. They called him not merely a hero, but a figure of destiny, a mortal chosen to rewrite the balance between men and monsters. Yet Jack himself, seeing such devotion, only smiled with a trace of sorrow. For though the world praised him, he knew each triumph carried a cost unseen, and his journey was not one of glory alone, but of burdens few could bear. And so, with sword in hand and shadows yet to face, Jack pressed on, the echoes of the giant's falls following him like thunder that never ceased. As Jack journeyed further into the wilderness, he came upon a solitary cottage at the foot of a mountain. Within dwelt an old man, his hair white as winter frost, who welcomed the weary traveler with simple kindness. Yet, when his eyes fell upon the embroidered belt Jack wore, the old man grew solemn. In hushed tones he spoke of a castle upon the high hill, ruled by the giant Galligantua, and guarded by a sorcerer whose wickedness rivaled the devil himself. There, noble knights and fair maidens had been lured, only to be twisted into beasts, birds, and creeping things. Among them the daughter of a duke, lived in misery, cursed into the form of a white deer. At dawn, Jack set forth, cloaked in invisibility, his enchanted slippers carrying him like the wind. He scaled the mountain. At the gates loomed two griffins, their forked tails lashing, their eyes glowing with malice. But they could not see him, and he passed unharmed. Hanging upon the gate was a golden trumpet inscribed with words of prophecy. Whoever shall this trumpet blow will bring the giant's overthrow. The black enchantment shall be undone, and sorrow shall give way to joy. Jack raised the horn to his lips. At the first note, the ground shuddered, and by the last, the very stones trembled as if they remembered centuries of suffering. The blast awakened more than walls. It stirred the voices of those long imprisoned, their cries rising on the wind, a chorus of sorrow and release. From the depths of the castle, knights, maidens, and creatures alike felt the chains of sorcery weaken. Galagantua, maddened with fury, seized his club and rushed upon Jack. But one stroke of the sword of strength ended his reign, his head severed from his body. The sorcerer, coward at heart, summoned a whirlwind and fled into the sky, vanishing like smoke never to be seen again. Then the walls of the castle began to dissolve, not with the crash of stone upon stone, but as though they melted into vapor, curling upward into the air. A stench of sulfur lingered, seeping across the valley, as if the land itself would not forget the taint of such evil. In the shifting haze, Jack glimpsed the form of a child, fragile, trembling, eyes wide with fear. For an instant he thought it was the spirit of Galagantua, as he once had been, a boy not yet consumed by darkness. But before Jack could draw near, the vision dissolved into the mist. When the smoke lifted, those who had been bound by enchantment stood free once more, restored to their true forms. The Duke's daughter, radiant and unbroken, wept with gratitude as the spell fell away, and the people of the land, delivered from both giant and sorcerer, proclaimed Jack their greatest champion. Yet in Jack's heart remained the memory of that fleeting vision in the mist, a reminder that even the darkest monsters may have once been innocent, and that victory, however great, is never without its shadow. Jack returned at last to the court of King Arthur, bearing with him the severed head of Galagantua as proof that the final terror had been vanquished. The hall rang with acclamation, for never before had one man subdued so many foes of monstrous power. Yet the king, in his wisdom, decreed that the truest reward for such deeds was not treasure nor title, but the hand of the Duke's daughter, whose freedom Jack himself had restored. Their union was celebrated with joy throughout the kingdom. A castle of noble stone was granted to them, with fertile lands stretching wide, where Jack and his bride would dwell in peace. Children were born to them. Laughter filled the halls, and for the first time the slayer of giants laid aside his sword, content to rest in the comfort of hearth and home. But on the night of their wedding, as silence settled over the castle, Jack heard once more the faint tolling of that unseen bell which had haunted his journey. Its note was softer now, distant as though carried by the wind. Not a summons, but a farewell. To Jack it seemed the voice of fate itself, marking the close of his long trial. The people praised him as a savior, raising his name into legend. Shrines and songs kept his memory alive, and mothers told their children of the youth who had conquered both monsters and sorcery. Yet in the corners of the feasting halls, the elders whispered a darker truth. When light triumphs too greatly, shadows stir anew. For balance will always seek its way. And so the tale of Jack reached its end, yet not without a lingering echo. For even as he lived out his days in contentment, the question remained, was his struggle truly finished? Or had he merely won a respite in a war without end? The story closes, but the silence it leaves behind asks what no voice can answer, whether the battle between human wit and the darkness of the world is ever truly done.